of all, I just want to thank these Summers. You're amazing, and it's important for you guys to recognize how profoundly blessed you all are to have me as a mentor, a teacher, and a colleague. Easy gift to the world. So thank you, Lee and girls. Let's sort of begin. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Went to school at Tyler School of Art, and then Alfred University. That's where I met Lee. And right now I'm currently teaching at School of Art Institute Chicago in the ceramics department. And so for this exhibition, Shongo, this work that you see here, it's all made within the last year, so it's very, very new body of work, and discovering a lot of new territory, and really kind of trying to challenge myself in terms of what my practice has been. And so this is a very kind of exciting and new time for me. And so there's also a lot of different narratives that are embedded in the work here, and so hopefully we can sort of unpack some of those narratives through our conversations with one another, the questions. But I guess to begin, the title Shongo of the exhibition is a sort of small sort of rural village in the southern tier of New York. And the Genesee River runs through Shongo, and it's a fly fishing catch and release spot that Lee and I would frequent after work. But that was a sort of location for me that was very important in terms of, I guess, my imagination, my development of myself sort of creatively, but also physically and spiritually, mind-body relationship. And so the idea of that place and fly fishing as a metaphor poetically is sort of runs through these objects, through different signs and references. There's ideas of lures, of desire, of skin, of permeability. And when I think about the notion of permeability, I'm interested in this idea of trying to invite the influences of the world writ large, the fullness of everything outside, but also equally to allow our own imaginations to have the capacity to live within that equally. So there's a sort of interesting sort of symmetrical versus an interior and an exterior identity. And so this sort of notion of permeability and skin as this kind of liminal space where things are becoming or things are changing. I'm interested in that. And there's moments of humor, of play, of awkwardness, of dancing, a choreography. As along the lines of the fly fishing, there's these incredible encounters of scale and perspective and proximity that happen at very specific times of the day, of the season, where these very sort of ephemeral hatches of a bug's life cycle emerge for 15, 20 minutes. And so there's just you're there witnessing this sort of collapse of time and space and distance and intimacy and life and death. And so it's just a really kind of beautiful foil, I think, for projecting how I relate to the world, or how I imagine a language performing within that. And so the fragmentation of the body, the fragility of the porcelain, of the color, there's a kind of mutedness, there's a minimal suspension of identity, it may be this, it may be that, and wanting to be comfortable in that is very important, and sort of staggering and trying to discover notions of grace within the inabilities or the parameters of materials and bodies and structures. I'm very interested in how materials and tools, things that are man-made, and in our own body shape our sort of understanding of who we are, and wanting to invite all of those things. Or while I'm working in the studio, I try to embrace process and the phenomena of material to kind of steer my language or how I relate to it. And so it's important that I leave enough room and enough space for those things to kind of challenge me or make me feel uncomfortable. And so as a maker, I'm constantly trying to leave space for operations of the tool or the language and its own capacity to render itself or create new perspectives, but also of like the agency of the material, and how what its currency is, like where it's from, and what it's, I guess, how do we centralize that, and the values of the language that we project onto that. All of those things are really important. So everything in this room, to me, it's kind of like coming out of that sort of metaphorical space of fishing. That's like visceral, that's poetic, that's like falling into the water, that's like getting your lure like knotted up or getting it caught in a tree or pricking your finger or like just seeing like all these beautiful fish and like insects emerge, encountering rocks and discovery. There's playfulness, there's wonder. All of these things are very important and are activated here in the space. And you can see like certain geometries, like the minimalist like gestures like the Carl Andre form here, or just geometric abstraction. Being that I'm a teacher in this past year, I've been like thinking a lot about, how do we share what we know and how do we claim what is more valuable than something else, and how information gets disseminated visually. And I'm very much like a tactile learner. And working in the studio, I really think that making is thinking. The sort of like the kinetic engagement with materials and tools. For me, that's where content or concept or knowing comes from. I think I approach language in a different way. Sometimes, like I have difficulty bridging the gap between what a word is and what a feeling is. And so I'm interested in the space, I guess the private space between those two things. And that's where the materiality of the tool comes in as a device to explore imagination within that. And so going back to this notion of education or manuals, I'm interested in the manual as its form. And so the kind of reductivist geometry, reference of early modernist abstraction. I've been looking at these manuals on how to make stairs. And these are like DIY manuals from the 70s. I'm just like fascinated by these orthographic drawings of the exploded stairs and profiles and risers and treads, and the moment where that becomes so abstract that you see it anew, like the moment where like the everyday stub toe becomes like ecstasy. So that's what I'm trying to kind of like go when I'm making the work, like work with the most, I guess, direct, mundane properties, and trying to see it as though I'm seeing it for the first time, or like distance myself or my language I project onto it enough that it teaches me something and allows me to grow. I mean, I think that's what I want to do. And so like looking at these manuals is a way to begin to try to touch on some kind of social language that is like our culture, our society, our schools, our institutions, the things that we share and communicate with one another, and recognizing that as a form that should be interrogated and played with and seen anew. So there's just images of there's sort of like this behind that paper. There's a little bit like a drawing that I made of like kneading dough and baking, and there's a kind of formlessness that's really important, and that it kind of like things don't become static and it's constantly evolving. Ideas of like scale and shrinking and like blowing up, macro and micro attention is really important. I think about that in terms of like our own imaginative relationships to memory, or just projections of possibility. There's a relationship of time. Yeah. And I also think that also plays into this desire. It's like, something being in the distance, the notion of perspective or proximity. And also how the manner in which we assess or evaluate proximity, scale, and proportion, I think that reveals a lot about our identities and who we are. And to me, it can be to look at that space can be a gateway into learning more about ourselves and learning more about the culture that we participate. So as an artist, I'm constantly fascinated by the near and the far, and collapsing those two things, or questioning what's right in front of me. What are its borders? Is it permeable like the scrim is? How static is the distance between these clay floor tiles and the bottom of my ribbon boots? Like that, to me, there's like a passage between those two things, that they become one another at a certain point. So I'm interested in playing with those tensions and seeing you form through all of that. So I think I've spoken long enough. But please ask questions and we'll go from there. But I'd like this to be a conversation. I just want to thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. So let's have a conversation. Ask questions.
Is the river on the hanging piece the actual river in Shongo area?
That's Currier and Ives illustration from 1886. It's called The Anxious Moment. So it's like this moment of tension. It's an illustration of this fisherman, and he's perched over this rock, and he has this taut line, and so there's this brook trout at the bottom of this whirling pool, and so there's this moment of reveal, something's going to flip, some kind of trap door. And so that anxious moment of possibility, I think, is important. But also this notion of time and the representation of the American West. There's a very kind of democratic but also mythological representation of the wild through those things. So that's perfect. It's Currier and Ives print.
How close is civilization to these areas? Is it reserved, or is it still kind of privatized and public land very close together?
Yeah. So the stretch of the stream, it is all public. In the southern tier, it's you divide Pennsylvania in half. You go 15 minutes north of the border. It's pretty much where it is, and it's a very rural farming agricultural community. There's moments when you're in certain sections of the river where it feels like you're in some other world. Outside of the world of cars and automobiles.
Cool.
Which is I think part of my own desire for that space. There's also sections where it then becomes a culvert of concrete once it gets into the next city.
Yeah. Well, some of these forms kind of remind me of dilapidated buildings and kind of roofs being torn off from weather and time. And you mentioned time as kind of a process that you think about. And I just wondered if, maybe those were things that kind of inspired you in that path you took to get to the river, that these things were fairly common on the visual journey through that.
Absolutely. And I don't know, the idea that the river's always changing. You're never sitting in the same water twice. And every time we go back to fishing, there'd be either a new tree down, or the water level is completely different. This was a notion of time that's, I think, pretty fascinating there. And I'm living in Chicago now, and part of me just really wants to be fishing, or being leg deep in water. The notion of gravity is different. That's, I think, part of the disembodied quality of some of the figures is also a kind of a psychological projection of me working in Chicago and hustling and being on a train. It's just gosh, this is a different quality of time than forest time or river time, or the other time of that hatch, that 15-minute moment where the birds and the bats are coming in, the fish are jumping up, and it's everything locks in.
It's like a swarm or something. It's
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Do you see these pieces as standalone sculptures, or do you find that they require the community to get the full experience? And this is clearly an installation made seemingly out of standalone individual pieces. So how do you
Yeah, I mean, I think
speak to that?
that's it's a problem that like I'm trying to explore. Coming from a ceramics background, where the genre of makers, community makers, is like about the fetishized object as commodity, and craft as a fetish, and it's about the exercised object and the object within itself and for itself. And part of me, like, I enjoy that, and my practice has been that, like, developing a technique where an object can stand and exist and carry its own space. But I want more than that. I want to be able to explore what the life of the object is. And so I imagine like the figurines to be more about, as you were saying, like a standalone object. I think they can exist anywhere. They can have their own context. But I think these larger sculptural and installation devices become like a theater or a stage around which you can begin to, I guess, unpack or explore what these figurines are. And like these props or devices of staging and installation. I think this is a language that's new to me, and so I'm trying to figure out a way where I can take my relationship, my interest in the discipline of object making, of ceramics and its traditions, and extend them into a different kind of discourse, whether that be sculptural or installation or performance or something.
My question was actually Ted's, but a follow-up to that. I was interested in a sense, then, every time you have an exhibition, it extends your creative endeavor to the point where it's really the culmination of, maybe your thinking at the time.
Yeah.
So when you came down here, no doubt you had some of this packed in the car, but you had a new space, and maybe this is an arrested moment from a long process for you, probably. So I was interested in, what is your reaction to what you put here? Did you get at something you didn't have before, or did this offer you a new chance to explore something?
Absolutely. I mean, like, I was still working when we came in. I mean, like, it's still very, like, fresh, and it's very new to me. So I haven't quite had an opportunity to process it all. But, I mean, so far, I'm taking risks, and I'm excited about what's happening, and I'm learning a lot from it. I didn't come here with, like, a floor plan, like, this is what I'm going to do. I mean, I had, like, 3 tables. It was, like, utter chaos. It was, like, totally disorganized, very unprofessional, practice. But, through just, like, being patient and just trying to listen to what the space is and how things are unfolding, something emerged. And so that, I'm excited about that.
Why did you decide not to make a floor plan?
I think that's, like, I need to learn something. I mean, I think if I plan it all out in my sketchbook, I don't need to make it. Like, to me, like, it's through the activity of, like, touching the stuff and laying these things down on the floor and moving them and struggling to hang that vinyl that, like, I understand its place or where it needs to be to shape its identity or its language. I need to be able to move things around. And so the notion of planning and the notion of, like, being improvising, being spontaneous, I think that's definitely part of my own sensibility. Trying to just, like, be fresh and see things, like, anew. Trying to think forward.
I want to learn more about these pieces on this wall. They seem to come from like a different environment than
Yeah.
the rest of the room, and they're kind of like at a focal point.
Yeah.
So if you want to just talk about it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, those, I understand like this sort of space, like with the shaker sort of reference bench and those pieces being of like an interior, both like metaphorically but also physically in terms of representing like the home. My grandmother was a Duncan's ceramics instructor, and so like I grew up painting like ornaments and music boxes and figurines and things. So like that's my entrance into art making was through kind of like the space of decoration or democratic kitsch stuff. And so the miniature fireplace, sort of saccharine sweetness of some of those things, to me, I believe, like they're not superficial, and they have like a structure and a profound depth to them. And so, yeah, the fireplace to me, it is, even though it's representing an interior, as an object, I'm just sort of lifting it and placing it. So sort of like the found object gesture. And then the photo album sleeve with the stained paper, that was, I mean, my grandmother, she documented everything. Like Tupperware bins, like thousands of pounds of photographs. My family, by and large, like they're just like throwing them away, but they're giving me all the people in them. And I'm fascinated by the fact that no one is interested in these, like, moments in time. And I don't have any relationship to that place. I don't know where the vinyl siding is, where that garage is, where that bird bath is, or where it comes from. But I'm interested in, I guess, the magic, or the imaginative space that material and that representation of place can elicit new possibilities, or new understanding of, like, what the parameters of our perception is. And so I think it's like the lens in there is a play on like the reflection of the light onto the garage itself as seen in the photograph, but also like just this moment of like looking, like look closer, like don't write it off, like even if it is boring, like get bored. What happens when you're bored? Yeah, and so the lens and the light's trying to, like, I don't know, pry underneath the garage and kind of, like, jack it up and see what's underneath there. So it's like finding, yeah, I don't know, like, it's like the moment of the Wizard of Oz, like, where the house lands on her and, like, the foot rolls in, something like that.
What is the material that you use to make the kind of skin textured, fabric-y, I can't even really describe it, it's really light and airy, and it's like a flag almost that's stored.
You take water and you make a solution of borax, and then enamels. So they're like a sign paint, enamel, or different like spray paints. Then that sort of creates like a film, a skin that sort of floats in the water. And then you can kind of like dip things into it and then pull it out. You can like marbleize paper this way. There's all kinds of sweet demos on YouTube that explore that. But
Did you dip the figures into it?
How did you feel when you? How were you feeling when you made all of the figurines and stuff?
It's I guess it's like fishing. There's moments of like desire and like exploration and like this is where I want to go, but then the material and the process demands something different of me, my body, and my tools, and so then I have to like self-regulate and adjust. And so there is this moment of like this anxious moment, or this moment of like something's tenuous, something's uncertain, and I just gotta like ride that line. But it's like thrilling, it's like very playful, and it's fragile, and I break things all the time, and so that becomes sort of like a teacher, and sort of use the language of the break to become structure. And yeah, so I guess there's also different moments in time and how to relate to making the figures too. Like there's moments that are like really quick and dispersive, and there's moments where it's like very like conscious and like very particularly placed. And it's important that both of those qualities of time are present in encountering the object and also in making them.
Could you comment on your teaching load and if your work informs your teaching or if your teaching informs your work in any way?
I think it's totally symbiotic. I mean, like I learn, I'm willing to say that I learn more from my students just because there's more of them than me. So it's constantly developing alongside one another. I think, I find quite often that, the message I give my students, how often do I take that in my own advice? And I've noticed over the last year that I've been, projecting this message, but not necessarily practicing it myself. And so I think it's been, this as an activity, as a culmination, I'm catching up to myself, or myself where I'd like to be a better teacher and be a better artist. I need to be more generous with, I guess, my work or my studio time, as well as my teaching practice. They certainly inform one another.
Do you have any other questions?
There's got to be more questions.
You want some more? Okay. Well, I was just curious if you could, knowing you, I know sort of how it works, but it is, even watching your work and knowing you, still somewhat of a mystery in terms of, some of the materials that you put together and, where you find them, how you work with them, the choices that you make. What are some of the, sort of secrets?
Yeah. I don't know, I think it's like maybe a process of accumulation, and constantly testing and experimenting, and making without, I guess, intention of it being something, but then having faith that, 2 weeks later, maybe next year, the year after that, will be that moment when, I'm in Alabama and I can use that piece. That's why I create some different parts and tools for different processes that it's like a hoarding, I guess.
Yeah.
Constructive hoarding.
I'm curious how this installation and maybe just your work in general relates to your ideas of interior furnishings and what that's for.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe even just your style of interior furnishing. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess it's I like the idea of, I like furnishing. I love homes. I love objects. I love floors and materials and spaces and architecture. I'm interested in how we move through those spaces, how we navigate them, how we centralize them, shape our relationships and our values and our ideas. So sleeping on a really poor bed is going to make you a different kind of person than, on a comfort-matic number 5 or something. So I think it's also suspending them. So it's not just this isn't just a parquet floor, but it's a different kind of body. It's a different kind of form. It's we through these tools, through this language of processing matter, we invented this. This aesthetically, formally, scientifically, we developed this thing. And what is it doing? We say it's a parquet floor, but is it really that thing? It's I want to ask that question. It's wallpaper, but photo paper, but it's representing some kind of marbled, agate stone, water, these different like ideas of representation I'm really fascinated in. Yeah, so but it's not, because it's not hierarchical. Like I said, that the kitchen counter isn't more important than, I don't know, the laminate on my drawers. I mean, I think all those materials have the same currency, and they all have sharing an equal agency in terms of like shaping my relationship with home. But valuing how my relationship with home is sprung out of that, like just being present with those things and opening the drawer.
In terms of your previous work, what do you think are the strongest points that evolved in your process? These seem figurative in some way to me, but then there's also kind of this structural aspect, and then you say abstract, so there's a lot of kind of different ideas going on. But what is it that's kind of stood out the most in your mind as far as the progress your work has taken through its evolution?
I think it's maybe more explicit representation or like reference to like specific forms, like whether that's the body or like, the manual as form or stairs or architecture. My work since graduate school has been very installation based, but it was all mostly chips of paint, a lot of coming out of like the decorative ceramic tradition, ornament, very sort of linear, a lot of the extruded porcelain line work. It was almost exclusively built of that. So it was very, very process driven, very like abstract and geometric and sort of like networks and I think I got to the point where I was no longer teaching anything. Like I wasn't surprised. And so I think the newness is the specific references.
Yeah. So with the experimentation with some of the new techniques of trying things, it's given you kind of a new sight into doing some ideas you had before to make something that you maybe had the idea for before, but in a new way.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
I think it's also gotten me to reevaluate like what the hobbyist or that decorative craft ceramic tradition is, and also like how my own creative thinking with the linear work as well. It's gotten me to reevaluate and assess that.
One of the things that I'm kind of struck by, just in terms of you talked about a lot of things. So I mean, there's just like a ton of ideas that you threw out there.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes it a little difficult for me to exactly navigate. Like,
sure.
And that makes sense given that it's fresh work. But one of the things that strikes me is the fragmentary nature of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could like speak to that, just like in terms of content or process or tool.
Yeah. I mean, I think I guess I'm interested in the operation of the fragment, like having just enough traction to elicit something as a springboard for it becoming something else. Just enough to make a linkage to this other idea of ground, whether that's like a psychological projected one, an actual one, a formal one, an invented one. So I think it's just like the notion of fragment, I think, is operational in a sense that it affords plurality and flexibility and creating language or possibility or shifting your relationship to these objects. And I think it's, there's moments where I challenge myself to stop and not project too much, like the moment where it becomes like an illustration, where things become more didactic or spelled out, like, which can be like aesthetic revelry. Like I'm in the blast, I'm like drawing and it's building. But then at a certain point that shuts off I guess, the work's challenge in me. I guess I'm looking for this space where I feel a little uncertain about what I'm making, and sort of staying there to reveal something. So it's like it's intentionally fragmented for fruitful becoming, or just like creating a space for an event to happen, a space for the imagination to explore. Was that an answer?
Yeah, I wasn't looking for an exact answer. I'm just really struck by how fragmentary everything feels. And they kind of feel like metaphor, like they're artifacts of metaphor in a way. But I'm not quite sure what the metaphors are because I'm just getting this little fraction of it.
Right. Well, I think that like the discontinuity, I think, is also important too, and like where the fragment affords connection because you can make that linkage, but also becomes like problematic that it illustrates a space that needs attention. Like this isn't working. Why is it not working? And that becoming like a teacher. I think that's important. Or like the need to mitigate the distance between these different like that's like binary understanding of the world, or like the way you think or process things in a linear way, or some kind of like
So I'm personally really interested in this kind of there's a disconnect between how we believe we experience the world and the way we actually experience the world. And, linear structures help us know the world in a way, but it's always a construct. And, it, as much as anything, it's about kind of mitigating our stress more than anything else, right? And so, I don't know, I think it's just interesting to kind of explore that idea of like disconnectedness, because like anything that we learn, it's presented to us as chapters and it's presented to us, in this linear way. But the reality is that we never learn anything that way. We always learn things through a fragmentary experience.
Oh, you got one more? Okay. Oh, good. You said that the piece on the wall there seems to resemble like home. Just basically a comforting idea or location. It seems like, with the bench there, you sit there from a comfortable location and you view the work. And then everything seems to fall apart or break apart, like you were saying, there are fragments, like everywhere. So it's like you're viewing nature, but to really get to know nature, you have to actually get up and go look at it, get closer to it. Then home becomes farther away. Going upon that idea of nature. Is that the intent that you were going for?
I mean, I think there is like similarity there, but then also I think the construct of what a home is in terms of like how society represents that, and how like our own mother culture has handed that down to us versus like different kind of like emergence of a home, or how that's defined or associated in an internal sense versus like an external sense to being in the water or being in the woods.
What else did you say? You're basically taking everything that we know of as being defined as the way we defined it and trying to actually figure out what it is instead of what we think is as defined.
And I'm not really, I think I'm not really trying to like answer that question, but like ask a closer question.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
How can I get? you have to open up the space.